I would now like to welcome our moderator for Panel 4, Assurance Challenges and Considerations, General Paul Selva. General Selva is currently the chair of the Board of Trustees at Aerospace Corporation. General Selva retired from the United States Air Force in July 2019 as the 10th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking officer in the United States Air Force and the second highest-ranking military officer in the nation, a position he held from July 2015 until his retirement.
Okay, that's good.
Copy that, sir. Welcome, General Selva and panelists.
Thank you. Because inevitably the bios describe a really old person. And while I am experienced, I don't consider myself old. General Cotton, I want to say thank you for your vision in doing a conference like this one. You said on the first day that this was about education and raising the strategic IQ. So in keeping with that theme, I'm going to call out some groups that I met yesterday. And in each of these two groups, there are people who are getting their first or at least early education on nuclear deterrence. So is the crowd from the 96 Bomb Squadron out there? You're kind of over here somewhere. Stand up, all of you. There's a handful. So if you were to look very carefully, you would note that the squadron commander brought a handful of captains, young officers who are learning the intricacies of strategic nuclear deterrence. And I used all three of those words together for a specific reason that I'll explain in a minute. And then there's a crowd here from Indo-PACOM J7, and I forgot where you're sitting. I think it's back here somewhere. If you guys, there you go. The Strategic Plans Division of Indo-PACOM J7. And you would think in the Strategic Plans Division, everybody understands strategic nuclear deterrence. I won't call the person out, but there is a person in that group where this is their first exposure to STRATCOM and nuclear weapons theory and nuclear deterrence discussions, which I think is amazing. So there are a handful of people who are getting a real education. We are not taking them gently to the edge of the pool. We are dropping them right into the deep end. So our panel today is on the challenges and considerations that attach to assurance. And I want to unpack that for just a minute because the word assurance actually has meaning. And if you look it up in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, what it says under the title of security is assurance is something that inspires or tends to inspire confidence. If you look deeper and try to find a definition of nuclear assurance, it's very hard to find. You can find in a joint pamphlet this following definition. Extended deterrence is directed at influencing adversaries to prevent attacks on our allies, while assurance is directed at communicating to U.S. allies our commitment to their defense. I would argue the second is fundamentally based on trust. Trust is based on clear communications. Clear communications are based on intentions and actions and the words that back them up. And so our methods of assurance across all of our allies are a mixed bag. They're different. They are different because of the perceptions that our allies and partners bring to the table. They are different because of the propensities of our allies and partners to talk about, host, and or operate with nuclear weapons. And all of those are important considerations as we think about building a strategy for assurance to our allies to try to do several things at once. The first is to convince our adversaries not to pull the trigger. The second is to convince our allies that we will be there for them. And the third and very important one is to actually act as a lever against proliferation of nuclear weapons. if our allies don't have to build them, host them, house them, and operate them because we're there for them, that means fewer nations have to hold nuclear weapons, which makes the uncertainty of proliferation a little more certain. And so in a world where we are a 2 plus the sum of some undetermined number of potential strategic adversaries, nuclear deterrence actually matters. And for those of you really paying attention, you will note that I didn't say strategic nuclear deterrence. I said nuclear deterrence, because they're different. They are different. The last thing I'll comment on before I open this up to the panel is we have a confusing set of language that we use because we are very comfortable with American shorthand. So the reason that Strategic Air Command wasn't Nuclear Air Command is because by definition, we didn't want to use the term nuclear. So strategic became shorthand for nuclear. All things nuclear were strategic. All things strategic are not nuclear. Strategy is important. When we say nuclear deterrence, it has a specific meaning. When we say integrated deterrence, we created shorthand for something that addresses what we've heard today and yesterday. Everything from high-tech non-nuclear to conventional strategic capabilities to nuclear across multiple combatant commands, multiple allies, multiple partners, and multiple friends. And if that's not confusing, I don't know what is. Strategy is, by its definition, an integrated process of planning and understanding ends, ways, and means, the will to act in the face of an adversary's misbehavior, right? And so I'm really particular about how I use words and what those words mean. And so I am, for one, quite confused by the choice of integrated deterrence. I am perfectly happy with integrated planning because that gets you comprehensive deterrence. They're different. And so as we think about our relationship with allies, partners, and friends, we have to bring them under that umbrella and understand how they fit into our view, not only of ourselves, but of the world we're trying to create. I think Sasha said yesterday, we are a group of like-minded democracies that see the world a particular way, and we want to foster that view of the world. I think we are all on common ground in that particular view. So I'm joined on the stage by 3 experts. You'll notice I didn't claim to be one. I just make guitars in the Pacific Northwest. But these 3 are actually brilliant thinkers when it comes to alliances, partnerships, and working together. And so I will introduce them as they are seated. Seated directly to my right is Air Vice Marshal Robert Denney. Robert has been in the Royal Australian Air Force since he entered their academy as a cadet in 1991. He's a fighter strike pilot, a test pilot. He's had multiple tours with Allied operations in the Middle East, did multiple tours in our Combined Air Ops Center. In January of 2023, he was named the head of force integration for the Royal Australian Air Force. Robert, welcome and thank you for being on the panel. Seated to his right is Pitt-Rashid. I knew I was going to get that wrong. Joe is the Director of Strategy and Policy for the Ministry of Defense. And I got that wrong. It's Strategy and Policy Director for Defense Nuclear in the UK MOD. He has spent the majority of his adult life in government, mostly in His Majesty's Treasury. He is known for setting up the Department for Science, Innovation, and Technology. He's relatively new to the Ministry of Defense, but don't let that fool you. And then seated to his right is Frank Miller. Frank is a friend. He's a principal at the Scowcroft Group in Washington, D.C. Frank spent 31 years in DOD, the NSC, and he is probably, to my thinking, one of the most clear-headed strategist when it comes to nuclear targeting and nuclear policy. He has worked across government. He served 3 years in the United States Navy as a surface warfare officer, and we were chatting just before. He got to go out and inventory the slickamens every day on his destroyer, which I think is very cool. He serves on the STRATCOM Commanders Advisory Board, the Defense Task Force for DoD Nuclear Weapons Management, and the Defense Policy Board. Frank, thank you for being here. So with that, what I would like to do is offer each of you an opportunity to give your perspectives on assurance and extended deterrence and how they apply in this increasingly complex world that we live in. And Rob, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to General Cotton for giving us the opportunity to present the Australian perspective for this. So assurance for us is aligned with what you said there before, except we don't use the Merriam-Webster dictionary, we use the Macquarie dictionary. And for us it's about, assurance is the process of convincing Australia of the US commitment to our defence. And to do that, it's a cognitive task that you kind of need to do on Australians, and so you need to view the world through an Australian set of eyes to understand where we come from. Because, we see things differently. We don't understand why you can have so many snakes and spiders and not all of them are poisonous. and what's with cheese in a can? Like, that does make no sense. But Australia has fought alongside US in every war since 1918, back when we were only 17 years old, not old enough to have a beer. But every war Australia has fought in has been as a part of a coalition. And so coalition warfare and doing things in partnerships is the way we look at it. And although capable and trained to operate independently, we always seek to work with others, and we innately expect that of others. We're not a superpower. We don't have nuclear arms at all. Although we operate in and around those who are, and some of our potential adversaries may be one, either, or both. And so we're somewhat potentially the small kid in the schoolyard. And sometimes you need to have a big friend. And that's where, we have foregone nuclear weapons for the reasons, for proliferation reasons, and have accepted the offer of extended nuclear deterrence from the United States, and we see that as our big friend. Even to the point where, unlike some of your NATO allies, we can't do carriage of US weapons. Actually, carrying a nuclear weapon on an Australian platform is a crime in our country for an Australian. Okay, so we are very dependent on the US for that. And so the fundamental question about assurance is, will the US be there? When the time comes, if we're attacked by an adversary, potentially stronger, potentially nuclear armed, will the US be there for us? And so what assures us, what makes us feel comfortable that the US will be there for us? Transparency, knowing what the US is thinking, what you're doing, what you've considered, what options you haven't considered. The better we understand what the US is thinking and doing and what's important to you and what isn't, the more we get that trust, the more we feel comfortable that we know what you're thinking and that being there to defend Australia will be part of those plans. Sharing information. That's where AUKUS becomes really powerful for us. It's an indication by the US of a willingness, and the UK, of a willingness to share high-level information, and that goes down to that trust again, and that you see us as valuable enough to share that information openly and transparently, and that makes us feel comfortable that you'll be there for us. Interoperability and working alongside and exercising alongside the US, again, furthers that trust. Having troop rotations through the Northern Territory regularly, being able to interoperate closely, have combined stores, collaboration on supply chains. Everything that is involved with mutual dependence builds confidence in us that the US will be there and goes towards those assurance. What doesn't assure us, or what impacts assurance or the credibility? So, funnily enough, much along the lines of the opposites of those. So lack of disclosure, lack of transparency, prolific use of no-fawn, those things, when I give you a document and then you say you can't show it to me because it's no fawn, yeah, that doesn't help. We all have national caveats and we all have secrets that we don't share, and that's okay, we get that. It's when it seems to be hard to understand, that's when, that just chips away at credibility of honesty. But sometimes when you're saying, hey, this is one of our deep, dark secrets, we can't give you that for this reason, that actually builds credibility, right, when it's a good reason, because it's about honesty and transparency. Independence. So when the US does things and we offer support and you don't necessarily want that, that just makes us feel not as valued as a partner, which again goes to that mutual dependence. And similarly, when the US goes alone, when we don't think they have to go alone, again, that goes to independence and lack of mutual dependence. And so you might be doing that for a reason that you see is totally justified, and it might be totally justified, but if we don't understand it, we don't realise why that is, then that just chips away at that credibility. And the last one is kind of not really appreciating or understanding some of our limitations, such as nuclear weapon carriage or whatever. The more you demonstrate you understand what our concerns are, can be involved with them, help solve them, the more that makes us realise that we're a deep and truly a true partner. So we're watching everything you say and everything you do to us and to others, and it's the sum total of all those interactions that we observe that builds credibility and builds assurance. When you're honest, it really helps. When you say, hey, Australia, if you go and do that, we're not going to have your back, or whatever, for whatever reason, that gives us lots of confidence that in all those other times you do have our back. And so that goes to assurance. Again, it comes down to that trust, open relationship. And when we feel like the US has got our back, which is all the time, we can stick our neck out further in activities and objectives aligned with your outcomes, because we know that you're there with us. When we don't feel as confident, obviously, when we're dealing with stronger powers, we can't be as bold. So and the more we have that trust, the more we can be aligned with your outcomes. Thanks.
Okay, can you hear me all right? I should start by saying how great it is to be here alongside so many other allies and to be able to participate in such a rich discussion. I've been saying to people all week that in the UK government, I walk around and I feel like there's a dozen people that understand what keeps me up at night. And here there's 800 people. And I don't know if that's a dream or a nightmare. So there's a few things I should say about the UK context at the moment. There's some things about the kind of particular moment we're in. You're probably sick of hearing this from the UK at the moment, but we've got a new government. And they've been very, very clear about their commitment to nuclear deterrence during the election campaign that we had. They've also just announced a strategic defence review that is going to consider a lot of the questions we've been discussing today. And so that process will really set direction for UK policy for the remainder of the Parliament, and that's expected to emerge in the first part of next year. There's some other things I should say about the kind of more enduring features of the UK's role as a nuclear power. The first thing is we're an independent nuclear power with our own strategic deterrent, and so we spend a lot of time thinking about exactly the set of challenges that the US faces. That's both the external threat environment and also the challenges of modernising an industrial base that was, over the last 20 years, calibrated for the world we were trying to create that is not the one that has come to pass. And we have a really rich dialogue with the US on how we meet those challenges together. The next thing to say is that we're both the recipient of an extended deterrence guarantee from the US and the provider of extended deterrence to our NATO allies, because we pledge our nuclear weapons to the defence of NATO. So we understand this question of assurance from both sides of the table. And then the third thing I was going to observe about the UK role is that historically we've been something like a backing dancer on US extended deterrence. And at various times in NATO's history, when there's been uncertainty, the UK has played a role in amplifying US messages of reassurance, and that's some of the history of the NATO high-level group. And we're used to playing that translation role to assist in assurance. So we've heard loads in the last couple of days about the threat picture, and you don't need to hear the same words in a British accent, so I won't say a lot about that. But in terms of what it means for extended deterrence, the main message I have is that we get it. We're grown-ups. We understand the dilemmas that threat picture creates. And we're a team, and I think the UK, like many allies, are really focused on trying to engage in a practical conversation about how we face that challenge together. And the more serious and practical that conversation is, the more reassured we are, because it says we're serious about addressing these problems together. The good news is, I think there's been some great work on that already, and a huge amount of credit should go to the DoD team with Vipin and Richard and their team. They've built up a lot of air miles and done a lot of reassurance in the last few years. We've added members to NATO. We've enhanced the strategic concept. We've reinvigorated the NATO high-level group. We're modernizing the DCA mission, and there are serious commitments to modernization programs, both in the UK and in the US. Those are all very reassuring things. I know that a lot of our NATO allies take a keen interest in order to understand the credibility of our assurances, not just in the policy posture, but what is happening to safeguard delivery of the programs that support that credibility. But of course, there's more to do. So I'm going to try and highlight 3 broad areas where I think we can do more, but this is by no means comprehensive, and there's action across a very broad waterfront. The first thing is that we've got to keep communicating through periods of political change. Obviously, political change in any country creates questions, uncertainty. Turnover in staff means relationships that existed change, and we have gaps and interlocutors shift. There's such importance on maintaining dialogue through those periods. And I think one thing I'd observe, and it's kind of on show here, is that the scale of the US system means there is space for a lot of really informed, robust, expert debate on some of these topics. I think allies and like us in the UK, we watch that debate and we see the conversation that goes on, and that is informative and instructive and rich, but it also means we understand some of the tensions that are going on, and we need to be talked to help understand how those things might play out. The second thing is that it's really, really important that we engage beyond the nuclear silo. And there are a few reasons for that. The first one is that, and I think this is true all around the world, but it's a really important part of UK doctrine, is that nuclear weapons are first and foremost a political tool, not a war-fighting tool. And that means the groups of people that are engaged in making decisions about them stretch far into the political arena, with all the kinds of additional pressures and considerations that that brings. And some of the war games we do bring that out really, really clearly. But it does mean that when we're thinking about nuclear IQ and decision-making and understanding each other, it's a really broad community, even broader than the community collected here today, that need to be engaged. The second thing about engaging beyond the nuclear silo is that it's what we call in the UK a national endeavour to deliver deterrence and make that credible. So we published a command paper earlier this year that set this out in some depth. It takes action from people far beyond the Ministry of Defence to deliver the UK deterrent. And we are mobilising our Department of Education, our Science Department, our Treasury, our wider kind of political class. We're engaging publicly in a more transparent way than we ever have before, and we're being more open and accountable to Parliament, because we need a lot of help to do the extremely difficult things that we are trying to do. And there is a community out there that have not been paying as much attention to the nuclear picture as it has changed. And we've got an education and information piece to do with that community, who are part of the team we need on side in order to succeed. And then the kind of penultimate point I want to make is about the complexity of the moment that we're in, and how that makes providing reassurance and deterrence much harder. So what we're involved in is much more than a 3-body problem, and it is inherently unstable. And it's true that there's a distinction between extended deterrence towards our adversaries and assurance for our allies. But of course, we primarily feel reassured when our adversaries are deterred. So there's an interaction between those things. And one thing that I think we've really got to make sure we think through, and this is particularly difficult in a crisis when you're making decisions at pace, and you can be focused on more tactical decisions facing a specific adversary, is making sure that we think through the second and third order implications of what third parties observe about our actions in a given crisis. So we know that China is watching and learning about nuclear deterrence as they observe what has happened in Ukraine. And as that conflict has evolved, maybe the lessons that they've learned have changed, but they are watching and learning from that process. So I think one of my takeaways from a few days here is that I can't leave the stage without using the phrase foot stomp. So if I'm going to foot stomp something, which I'm taking, I think means emphasize, it's that, in the last few years, we have been learning about ourselves, we've been learning about each other, we've been learning about our adversaries, but really importantly, our adversaries are learning about us, and they will continue to learn about us as we face more and more difficult situations. So we must be really intentional about the lessons that we want them to learn as they observe our actions.
Frank, over to you.
Thank you. Is it on? Yes. First one, as everybody else has, and rightfully so, I want to thank General Cotton for pulling this together. I mean, this has been a really great symposium. The panels are terrific, and kudos to all involved. But Tony, thank you very much. Let me begin by pointing out that the Strategic Posture Commission, of which I was a member, full disclosure, had many messages. But one of the key messages that has been overlooked is the following very simple statement. Allies need the United States, and the United States needs allies. Our allied relationships are central to our standing in the world, and extended deterrence is central to our alliance relationships. It's a key to preventing armed aggression and bullying, thereby strengthening the peace and avoiding additional proliferation. And deterrence is better accomplished as allies than trying to do this independently. In a very different context, Ben Franklin observed over 200 years ago, we all need to hang together, or we will hang separately. The Posture Commission was clear. The world has changed, and we must be able to deter and fight, if necessary, both China and Russia simultaneously. Russia and China's cooperation is obvious. Combined military aggression, either planned or opportunistically, while not a certainty, is certainly possible, and we can't ignore this. So what does the United States have to do to assure our allies that we are up to this challenge? Part of it is talking the talk, and part of it is walking the walk. Let me give you 4 areas. Strategically, we need to fixate, and we need to fixate urgently, on changing our approach from a single-front war to a 2-front simultaneous war. Politically, Russia and China are working across the board every day to undermine allied will and confidence in collective defense, with political, military, and economic blackmail, cyber campaigns, and other influence and gray area ops to include wet ops, and in Putin's case, with naked nuclear threats. Our job is to reassure allied governments and publics of our ability and will to resist. In the North Atlantic, that is also NATO's job. And in the Pacific, it is the 3 nations represented here, plus Japan and other allies. And frankly, as has been discussed in other panels today and yesterday, with publics, we have done a very poor job in this area since the Cold War ended. We need to get much better, and we need to get much better very quickly. So strategically and politically, I've talked about. Militarily, Russian and Chinese cooperation has obviously stressed our mutual ability to maintain extended deterrence. Mostly, however, And contrary to the doomsaying of some pseudo-strategic analysts, it stresses the U.S. military, but it stresses us in a manner which is manageable if we make the right decisions and the right investments. To be clear, in Europe, NATO ground forces, augmented by U.S. ground forces and NATO's highly capable air and naval forces, particularly the British Royal Navy, should, with some U.S. augmentation, be able to defeat Putin's forces. In the Pacific, the burden is on U.S. naval and air forces, assisted by Australian and Japanese forces. We do not require, nor should we seek, a major ground force presence in the Pacific, except for the separate and distinct case of Korea. That said, our needs are clear. Our airlift capacity needs to grow, especially for the Pacific theater. If you think about what was required to supply Ukraine in the early months of 2022, and now you extend that across the Pacific Ocean, our airlift is lacking. We need to accelerate fielding hypervelocity systems to defeat enemy A2AD. If we can't eliminate the A2AD threat, the number of surface ships we have is not particularly meaningful because they'll never get in the fight. We need more submarines, and AUKUS should help here with the collaboration of our British and Australian friends. And after decades of neglect, our defense industrial bases face a significant and similar challenge in this regard. Happy words from governments are not the answer. Real action and real collaboration between governments and industry are needed. I want to lavish significant praise on the Department of Defense for its defense industrial base strategy. What's lacking is for the White House to get involved and convene meetings with major defense firms, with the startup firms, with the sub-tiers and the suppliers, and to come up with meaningful public-private partnerships that help improve our defense industrial base, and do it now. And then we come to the big three overarching capabilities which undergird all of our operations globally: space, cyber, and nuclear. In space, we must keep up and surpass the enormously vigorous Russian and Chinese offensive and defensive space control capabilities. Same is true in the cyber world. We need to do a better job at our efforts to modernize both our strategic nuclear forces and the nuclear weapons complex. And given the combined Russian-Chinese threat, the existing modernization program, as the Posture Commission stated, is necessary but not sufficient. As you all know, unfortunately, there are delays with the Sentinel program and likely with the Columbia program. This puts a burden on some of the areas that the Posture Commission talked about, which means enhancing current forces. So it means after this New START treaty expires, reloading the tubes that were neutered on the Ohio-class boats and probably MIRVing some of the Minuteman systems. For the larger term, we're going to need more Columbia boats, and we're going to need more B-21s than in the current program. Finally, we also need to augment our theater nuclear capabilities to deter Russian and Chinese use of the very large arsenals of nuclear mid-range and short-range systems they have invested in, despite U.S. forbearance. In my judgment, this is the role of slicker men, and we should proceed ahead as quickly as possible and realize that we used to deploy nuclear weapons on our ships. We used to know how to do that. It's not that hard. We need to get on with it. And finally, and it goes a bit to Paul's question about what is integrated deterrence, and panel 2 yesterday and the comments of those panelists. Let me suggest that I can describe for you integrated aggression. Integrated aggression is what I suspect we will have to face from Russia and China on day one. integrated operations, including gray area, sabotage in the homeland, in something that DHS has to be involved in, conventional attacks, cyber attacks, space attacks. We're not ready for this. We need to bring that all together. And to use a phrase which is hackneyed and trite, real, it's a whole of government effort. I mean, it involves doing things right now to improve our strategic communications. It involves preparing for contingencies that were discussed yesterday by General Jacoby. It involves getting our strategic integrated planning together, again, to what Paul was saying. So all of these things have to be taken up to give us an integrated capability to deter integrated aggression. And finally, let me close by saying I think the greatest threat today is accident or miscalculation. By accident, I mean some problem, some crisis created by an overzealous Russian or Chinese pilot or naval commander. We've seen some of this in the past. These activities don't occur just because. They occur because they are carrying out the activities directed by Putin and Xi. This is an area of concern. And second, strategic miscalculation by Putin or Xi or even Kim Jong-un regarding the steadfastness of our commitment to our allies. And historical analogies don't prove anything, but I would point out to you that in the 1930s, as Hitler began his aggression and first occupied the Rhineland, there was no Allied reaction, and then took Austria, and then got his way in Czechoslovakia. Why should he have believed that Britain and France actually were going to fight over Poland? He didn't. And why should the imperial Japanese clique that was ruling, the military clique that was ruling Japan, have thought that the United States would in fact react if the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor was taken out? It's those kinds of miscalculations that we need to avoid. We need to make clear that we will defend our interests and our allied interests, and in that way, hope to achieve both assurance and deterrence. Thank you.
Thank you all. Let me start with a couple of overhead questions, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience. So the first one is, are there ways that the United States can help encourage collective defense amongst allies, partners, and friends in this new world where Russia and China actually collaborate with one another in ways we hadn't anticipated? And Frank, I'll start with you, and then we'll work our way back up this way.
I think there are, and I think we're doing it. I mean, I think we have, as Joe indicated, we have reinvigorated NATO planning. NATO can fight together. NATO, if you look at the way Putin's troops are behaving in Ukraine, NATO has much better forces, and what we need is an integrated defensive capability with clear lines of command, and that's what NATO's all about. In the Pacific, the activities with the Japanese government and the Korean government, the Japanese government and the Korean government, and Canberra, I think, is also evolving an integrated capability, excuse me for using the word, again, to have contingency plans to react to various forms of aggression. And by showing that we have the military capability to respond, and by having the political will to focus our various governments, I think we are doing the right things in that regard.
Joe?
So you mentioned collaboration between our adversaries there, and I think it would be unacceptable if we let them gain an advantage over us because they collaborated more than we did. And I think someone, and I agree with this, described some of that relationship as a marriage of convenience yesterday. But if they've swapped rings, then something real still happened there, right? So the relationship may not be as deep, but it is material. And on what more can be done to encourage collective defense, I think it's easy to underestimate the huge convening power that the US can bring. I mean, here is an example. We're all in the room talking about this together. And NATO is one very powerful construct for bringing one set of allies together. Clearly, the thing we are particularly worried about is some kind of coordinated or opportunistic action that means we're confronted with action in two theatres at once, and being able to convene a conversation beyond NATO, I think, is a big value add.
Yeah, I would echo those comments on the convening power of the US. So when I was younger, we didn't do any exercises with Japan. Australia did not. But then through doing trilateral exercises with the US and Japan in Guam, then that evolved to us doing genuine bilateral activities and Japan coming down to Australia. So the US has the ability to bring all those countries together, and because it has such wide-ranging contacts and communication, and then by exercising together and operating together, we all get that mutual dependence and more skin in the game for each other. And I think that is the power. So it's using that convening power.
Could I add just one thing? Because I should have said this earlier, and Robert raised it, and that is fixing some of our own internal rules with regard to no foreign and other. I mean, I was involved in 03, 04 as President Bush 43 tried to work with Prime Minister Howard and Prime Minister Blair to put selected British and Australian officers on SIPRNet. The system turned it into SIPR releasable Australia, UK. I mean, we had situations where in Iraq, British forces would bring in reports which went to the Intelligence Fusion Center and were typed up, no foreign. True fact, that's a true fact. And so, I mean, that doesn't build trust, it doesn't build confidence. We're working on AUKUS, and it's 2 years into AUKUS, and we still haven't fixed ITAR. Somebody needs to care, somebody needs to kick ass, somebody needs to change things, otherwise we become the victims of our own incompetence.
If I could pull on the thread of convening power just a little bit more, are there specific venues or planning processes or exercises, to your point, Rob, that bring particular value to this notion of assurance? And are there potentially venues we're not thinking of or haven't attempted to use convening power to bring to the fore that might be helpful?
From my perspective, the broader the audience, the more powerful it is. So instead of a few specific highly trained individuals doing things, the broader you can make it across larger scale activity, the more powerful it'll be, because it touches more people, and it is an overt larger display of commitment. So to me, that's where we can do it. We do a lot of activities together, but if you can involve greater collectives of people, so not just bilateral but trilateral, 4, 5, 6 nations, then they start seeing common ideas, common themes, common norms, and to me that becomes exponentially more powerful.
Yeah, I think games are a really powerful construct for this, and there's a level of detail that we should approach in those about not just what kind of war-fighting decisions are made, but what is happening with everyone's capability all around the world. The most obvious example would be how many SSNs are in the water and whose SSNs are going where. I note that they have a dual role in the UK, obviously, to protect our bombers as well. And if those are staying in the North Atlantic, then some protection's got to stay in the North Atlantic. So I think that getting to that level of below just not the warfighting decision, but the capability and deployment is a level of detail that I think does breed a lot more confidence.
I completely agree with that. I think one other thing that we can do is and it's a problem here at home, we need to stop talking ourselves down. I mean, as I suggested in my opening remarks, we are capable of fighting in two theaters. There are two different kinds of wars. We need to build some capabilities up, But to say we need to just completely pivot to one side or the other is just ridiculous. And it only helps, well, there's two things. It helps the Russians and Chinese believe in themselves, and it undercuts our allies' confidence in us on the notion that we're going to desert one group to go with another group, not understanding that by deserting one group, we're showing that we can desert anybody at whatever we choose.
A question from the audience, I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. Alliances, by their definition, are reciprocal. All the parties in the alliances agree to particular commitments and live by those commitments. Friendships, on the other hand, can be relationships, I'll use the word of convenience, although generally for the United States, we consider our friends nearly allies. We are just not bound to them by treaty. Are there mechanisms that we can use collectively as allies to convince our friends of our commitment to this common cause of democracy? And how do we do that without, in the current situation, appearing needy, because we independently don't have the resources to do the things we can do collectively? And there's a lot packed into that little question. I'll start with you, Frank.
Thanks. So I think there is. Again, I mean, the whole question of strategic communications, which is much more than words. It's people building schools. It's USAID. It's the Peace Corps and their analogs in our foreign governments. I mean, it's the whole point of indicating that democracies are strong and vital, and that we help our friends, and we do things for our friends because they're valuable to us. It's not just a one-way street. And I think the more we are able to reincorporate that, because we used to do that during the Cold War, reincorporate that into U.S. policy and to allied policies, I think that strengthens us in the world.
I think there's something here about demonstrating stake in different arenas. So one of the things we anticipate from Putin is that he thinks he can demonstrate that he just cares more sometimes. And as we try to counter that, there's a desire to obviously provide reassurance, but it's really, really important that that is credible. So we've got to be sure that we mean it, and we've got to make sure that we're putting in place the capability that supports that intent, because a really difficult situation for us to get in is if the credibility of those commitments is undermined because they've been tested, and we know that wherever those vulnerabilities are, our adversaries will seek to play in that space. And if that credibility is undermined, then a lot starts to fall away with it. So I think that we've got to match the intent with the action to make that work. The other thing I'd say is that I think, I played a lot of team sports growing up, and one of the best things about being in a team is holding each other to account. And I think you can do that through an alliance structure, but I think friends can do that as well. It's a different framework, but I think certainly within the UK system, we're really happy to be held to account, and we expect that, and that's a constructive, positive thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting question viewed as an Australian. So we only have two allies, the US and New Zealand, but we have a lot of friendships and very close friendships, the United Kingdom and Canada and many other countries. And so actually that's our predominant way of interacting with other nations, is in that friendship structure. But we still expect a lot of our friends, and they expect a lot of us, and we have demonstrated and our friends have demonstrated they can deliver on that expectation. So to us, it goes back to my points I was making about assurance of you can do the same assurance and have the same impact in a friendship arrangement vice a formal alliance. And so to us, those friendships are a core part of our defence.
Great. I'm going to flip this on its head for a minute. This question also comes from the audience, particularly with respect to China. China's economy has become intertwined in the economies of every nation represented on this podium, and just about every one of the 15 nations represented in this room. we think of assurance as a mechanism of convincing our allies, partners, and friends of our mutual commitments. Is there a way to think of that assurance relationship as a way of also assuring the leadership in China that we are not about regime change, we are not about tearing down their structure of government, but about supporting our partners, friends, and allies in this common cause of democracy and freedom? And how do we communicate that in a way, as a group, that provides a level of assurance to our Chinese competitors that we're not after regime change, but also sends the message that if they meddle in our affairs, we're serious? And I'll start with Rob.
So we view assurance as something you do have with a potential adversary, in terms of you can assure them that if you don't do anything silly, we won't do anything in retaliation. So that's part of the communication message. And again, you establish that relationship with confidence, demonstrated, interconnection, and there will be significant impacts if there was to be such a confrontation. So we believe that you can do that, and the more united you are as a group in communicating that, the more effective that should be in providing assurance to any other third party.
It's a great question, and it's absolutely integral part of deterrence theory that, we want to say if you take this course of action, it will go badly for you. That's the deterrence bit. If you take an alternative course of action, it will go better for you. And that's the assurance bit. So it is absolutely fundamental that we get that right. And I think there are scenarios in which if we make things existential for our adversaries, then we are going to invite them to escalate. And that is not what we're trying to achieve here. So it's an important question. It's a really, really difficult one. One thing that is complex is that I think at one point in the 20th century, there was a real focus on drawing red lines, being really clear about what kind of action we were trying to deter, what the consequences of crossing that red line would be. Our thinking has evolved since then, and we now, and this is a part of UK doctrine, we are deliberately ambiguous about the exact circumstances and scale at which we would use nuclear weapons. That is intended to complicate the decision-making process for our adversaries. It avoids putting down red lines that they can test and walk up to. But as we get into more tense situations, and if our adversaries want to start testing those boundaries anyway, despite that ambiguity, then I think we have to be alive to communicating more clearly that deterrence and assurance trade-off to our adversaries. And that is, that's dynamic, and it's got to be tailored and specific to the circumstances that we're in.
That's a really hard question.
I didn't write it.
I know. And I think there are really two parts to it. The first is, how do Putin and Xi get their information? I mean, we could be putting out policies in plain language, but by the time it gets to them and goes through various filters, it may be turned on its head. And we have historical occurrences where things that the United States did to clearly indicate that there was no threat got turned into, oh, they're getting ready to hit us. This during, one classic example is during the coup with Gorbachev. So how do they get their information, and are there malign people spinning that? And you can't control that. The second is where a regime's intentions clash with our view of status quo. And so, invading Ukraine is not on. That's armed aggression in Europe. Not only breaks a whole series of agreements, arms control agreements, which the Russians had signed up to, but it's wrong. And these are, pushing them back out is not designed to be a threat to Putin. Putin may have created a situation where it is a threat to his continued personal rule. Not our fault. The same thing, I think, applies in the Pacific, where the 9-dash line, the South China Sea belongs to us. No, it doesn't. It is an international waterway. And so there is going to be a situation where if the regime nails its flag to certain aggressive policies that are designed to harm our allies and harm our interests, that does become a condition. But look, if we really had a campaign to undermine the Chinese or the Russian leadership, they'd know about it. We'd be doing a whole lot, particularly with the internet, that we're not doing. And so it's a question of how it's interpreted and where they're pushing us.
Let me shift to the home front, and this is a really interesting question about public support for nuclear deterrence forces, public support for the investments that are required. And it strikes me, and I'll add to the question, that as a relatively young person, these were conversations that were had in campaigns. They were represented by political parties. They were represented in platforms at conventions. Joe, you just referred to the fact of the existence of the deterrent force being part of the recent campaign for the new government. It strikes me that we have an obligation to inform and educate, and that the level of discourse, both political and public, on nuclear deterrence is wanting, at least in the United States, in a way that is probably unhealthy. My words, not anybody else's, and my personal opinion. What are the mechanisms we can use? So it's a political and military combined strategic issue, and we have that conversation quite readily. But we have three very different perspectives on the stage about the utility and necessity of nuclear weapons and the deterrent they provide. What are the tools we can use to educate our populations in an open and reasonable and factual way? And how might that play out in the three different sort of environments that are represented on the stage? And again, Frank, I'll start with you.
So I think that we have done a relatively poor job as a government for a long time, over several administrations, in indicating what the cost of our nuclear forces is. And at last costing, which I think came out of the nuclear modernization program during the 2018 nuclear posture review, was that the modernization program was going to cost between 6 to 7% of the U.S. defense budget. Defense budget's gone up. The program has had some overruns, but it's still about 7%, and that includes operating costs for the SSBNs. We need to make more of that fact. And one thing that, I hate to say this because I'm going to sound as old as I am, we used to do during the Cold War was we used to send people out to speak. I don't want to tell you how many trips I made to areas and to talk to Rotary clubs and all of that. And I think the more we get the word out, this is, as Mattis said, Jim Mattis, this is a small cost to avoid destruction. I'd love to see the president come here and have Tony host the president and have a speech about our nuclear forces and how much do they cost and how little that cost is compared to everything else. So I think if we make the effort, we can certainly put more information out into the public venue. Whether that's convincing or not is another question. But I don't think we have been doing as much to indicate the value and the cost as we are capable of doing.
So we've been thinking about this quite a lot in the UK, and amongst the various responsibilities I have the misfortune of bringing together in my role, communications is one of them. And I can tell you that in the UK, public support for the nuclear deterrent is about as high as it's ever been and as high as at the peak of the Cold War. But the support is considerably higher than people understanding what it actually is. There's a gap there. So we're thinking about how we address that, and we're thinking about which sectors and segments of society we're trying to target. And some of those people, we want them to understand and support there's quite a few thousand people, tens of thousands of people we want to get involved, because we're trying to recruit program managers and welders and submariners right across the country at the moment. And that brings a lot of economic opportunity to parts of the country that need it. So there's an economic benefit story we're trying to tell there as well. In the first instance, I mentioned that we're thinking about government communication directly in sort of public documents and things like that. But we've got to be realistic that most people are not reading government publications. So we're also looking at whether we can be more confident about the access that we give journalists, for instance, to some of our facilities. And our initial sense is that there is a huge amount of interest in that from journalists, from influencers of different kinds. And we're really exploring the more creative ways we can try and get that message across, both about the benefits case, as Frank describes, and making sure that people understand the threat and the benefit of the deterrent, but also what it takes to deliver it. Because, and this is a terrible thing to admit here, I used to work in our treasury and I've cancelled some major programs in my time. And when people the main thing people know about you is the pound sign, that's when you're at risk. So we've got to make sure that's not the only thing people know about.
Yeah, it's a bit different for us. So, manufacture, storage and stationing of nuclear weapons in Australia is illegal. But we appreciate the need for it as a deterrent effect, and we respect the US policy on ambiguity with respect to aircraft and ships passing through and working through Australia. But bear in mind, even just the presence of nuclear-powered conventionally armed submarines in Australia is politically controversial. And so a debate about nuclear weapons in Australia is not going to go too far. But I would also say that there is an understanding of the fact that there is a role for them in being a cornerstone of security as part of enjoying US's extended nuclear deterrence.
Can I pull on that for a minute? So understanding that the possession and use of nuclear weapons in Australia is illegal, right? Is there a clear understanding in the Australian populace that the United States and our allies do extend over Australia our extended deterrence, that if someone were to attack Australia with a nuclear weapon, we are committed to act in kind? Is that known, discussed, thought about in either academia or public discourse?
In public discourse, I would say that there's an expectation that if we were under attack that the US would respond, and the manner of the response would be a variable depending on who you asked. In academia, I think they would understand that the US's interpretation of that, but in public discourse, it would probably be a question of how, it could be an option as to the means of response. But there's general understanding of the fact that of extended nuclear deterrence and what that means and what the US's expectations of the US in response to that.
I was just going to add an extra point because it's relevant to the theme we're talking about, but one thing that lands really well in the UK is framing our defence commitments and security around the concept of alliance and NATO, and that holds popular appeal and appeals to a broad set of values in British society.
In a different vein, all of us are beneficiaries of living in free capitalist economies, and those economies are intertwined and benefit from free trade and other mechanisms that bring some degree of resilience to our partnerships and alliances. Are there things we could be doing in our economic relationships that would build deeper and more resilient societies and economies to convince our adversaries that attacking or attempting to influence parts of those societies or economies is not to their advantage?
The Australian government a few years ago has pursued aggressively guided weapons explosive ordnance enterprise, and that is the ability for us to manufacture within Australia guided weapons, albeit under US licence, weapons that would otherwise be manufactured in Australia and in a time of crisis then need to be transported out to Australia, assuming we had those links. And furthering activities such as that, such as regional base maintenance for common vessels and aircraft, they're activities that we can definitely pursue that provide resilience, gives Australia some resilience, but also resilience for US forces in and around Australia. That would definitely provide that kind of awakening.
So I think it's an excellent question. We have to be realistic about, kind of Frank alluded to this earlier, the ability our allies have to hold at risk things that we care about inside our own territory, particularly through cyber. And that will have a political salience for our leaders, which is not kind of more important, but it has a different quality to activity that takes place beyond our borders. And we have to accept that part of what happens with adversaries that have that kind of capability is that we are capable of being deterred in some circumstances. So how are we, through denial and resilience, making ourselves less vulnerable to that kind of coercion? And I think that is a really important part of the next phase of our planning. The other thing I'd observe is that, we've all spoken about cost. One of the best things we can do to address that is to grow our GDP and be able to afford to do more. And one of the great strengths of all of our systems has been open, capitalist, free trading societies. And I think that's an important part of the way we collaborate and make all of this more achievable.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something Joe said, then go in a different direction. I mean, we should be able, we are able, we need the will to do it, to make certain that none of our economies are hostage to any particular resource which is owned or found solely in a Russian or Chinese sphere of influence. We need to make sure we're doing that. And I think we're beginning with the specialty metals and the mining and all that to be able to do so. The other thing, and I will dip my toe a bit into national politics and shouldn't, is we need to stop talking down allied relationships. I mean, we need to make sure that everybody understands what democracy and a democratic world mean. The SPC spent some time on that. But our democracy cannot exist if we live as an island without any other democracies. And we don't make that point enough. And our relationships with our allies are not transactional. They're broad. We made this decision in the Truman Eisenhower period that we were going to get involved, that non-involvement in 2 world wars brought us in anyway. And that a network of democracies around the world and free trade nations is critical. And sadly, in the last 5 to 10 years, the notion's grown up that our allies are just taking advantage of us. And that needs to be slapped down. It's patently untrue, and we need to slap that down. And unfortunately, it's intruded into the national political debate, and perhaps after this election we can get to repairing that. But I think that's crucial, that Americans understand how much we need allies just as much as they need us.
Great. China has extended its capacity to strike forces all the way to the west coast of the United States. Russia has extended its capabilities to strike U.S. and allied forces all the way to our eastern seaboard. Given the, again, multiple regions represented, are there things we could be doing as allies to strengthen our basing and access processes to help complicate the collective Russian and Chinese area access and denial strategies in ways that could help us deter conventional conflict and also open the door to credible nuclear deterrence?
Again, I'll go back to some things I said. I think the ability to suppress Russian and Chinese anti-access capabilities is clear. We're not doing. We have a system under development, the conventional prompt strike, which is an Army and Navy system, which is being deployed at the most leisurely pace possible. And if you think the year of decision with China is in 28 or 29, we're way behind the curve already. So I mean, we need to take that sort of thing seriously. Again, I mean, the Strategic Posture Commission talked about the need to bolster and improve our regional nuclear capabilities to deter a buildup of Russian and Chinese regional nuclear capabilities, as you're alluding to. The Commission didn't take a position. I take a position that's slick a man. But again, if you look at the development and deployment line, it's a lot longer than it needs to be. We did stuff in the 50s with a lot less sophisticated technology that was, Polaris went from idea to first deployment of the George Washington in 5 years. 5 years, developed the missile, the submarine, and the warhead. So there are things we can do if we put our mind to it, but we don't, as a nation, take these things as urgent. And again, back to the Posture Commission, I've broken record on it. The Posture Commission, I think somebody said, and Madeline will correct me, 100 times we used the word urgent because it is urgent. So I think there are things we can do that we're not doing.
So I think, as you know, in the UK, we have never sought to match the scale of the nuclear arsenal that Russia has, and part of our doctrine today remains that as long as we can hold at risk what they care about, then that will deter the kind of attacks that we're concerned about. And so we have historically put less emphasis on our ability to defend and more on our ability to threaten. So we have a slightly different kind of history of thinking about this. But as has been the case throughout the whole history of nuclear weapons, we know that they are developing their defenses in ways that make it harder for us to threaten them and enable them potentially in their minds to be more assertive. So we do have to keep thinking about how we enhance survivability, our ability to penetrate their defenses, about the range we can operate at. And in particular, I think we need to test ourselves on the kind of circumstances in which these questions could become most acute. So I'm imagining that we are 1 or 2 years into a large-scale conflict when conventional forces have been worn down, when we are having to think about what is deployed where, and maintaining the ability to credibly threaten nuclear strikes will depend upon some conventional capability and support, some basing choices, our ability to operate in certain regions that we might be able to plan for now, but we need to be able to safeguard quite far into a conflict. And that kind of forward thinking, I think, is an area we really need to work on.
Yeah, in the Second World War, Australia was the unsinkable aircraft carrier that allowed US forces to mass flow through and recover from. If there was a war in the Pacific, we would potentially be we would be vulnerable to strikes. Understanding the US force flow, where they're expecting to put things, what they're expecting, what the US are expecting from us, and what they'd provide to help protect them, that's a really good means of us understanding what the expectation is and the plan, and we can work towards that. And then plus that combined with the assurance that if we were directly attacked, there'd be a level of commitment to our defence would be the big ways we could benefit us.
Thank you. I have an entire page of questions that I'm not going to get to ask. We've just got a couple of minutes left. I'd like to offer each of you a minute for a closing speed round, and we'll start with Frank.
Thank you. It's a great panel. I think we put a couple of things on the table that are important and people should take away and think about. I don't need to enumerate any of them because they're all important. I mean, if you rank order things, people always go to the top 2 and let the last 3 to 5 go away. But good panel, thank you. I think we've made our points.
Thank you, Frank. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, 2 points. The first one is that, if the question is about assurance, I just want to say that we feel very confident in the nuclear relationship and in NATO. So we are in a strong position today. The second thing is one of the points I made earlier. We get the challenge that a two-peer plus environment creates. We understand. We want to have a conversation about how we deal with it together, because that's teamwork.
The perspective I've given today is uniquely Australian. Every ally will have a different version of that and different thoughts and what makes them important. But similarly to your comments, Joe, we are very assured, we are very confident that we have a very good, deep and trustworthy relationship with the US.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for participating in the panel. I want to thank the audience for being involved, and boy, they just erased all the questions and said I have 0 minutes left. Two things strike me that I think I just want to emphasize. One is, while we are like-minded about the value of democracy and the value of protecting freedom, we each, as sovereign entities, bring our own independent views of what's important. Those are our interests. And where we have mutual interests and are willing to expend the blood and treasure of our young men and women and our populations to defend those interests, we are always, always stronger together. The second point I would make, because a couple of you brought it up, is we did not discuss AUKUS explicitly because it would have taken us all afternoon. It is also a relationship that is founded on common interests. And I think, again, that exemplifies the notion of being stronger together. So I deeply appreciate being able to share the stage with you, and I thank you for your participation in the panel. Thank you all.